Good afternoon, Synod. Before we begin this item, there are a couple of bits of business to bring to your attention. One is to remind members that if this is your first time being here in person as a voting member, and you've been on Zoom and using the online voting system up until now, you need to go and collect your voting card before you can then proceed with any voting this afternoon. Also, there has been a driving licence found, so if you think it might be yours, the security outside have it, so perhaps go and check your bags as you leave to see whether or not you have it with you. Hopefully you've checked your pockets now. This afternoon we will be focusing on safeguarding. I am conscious that there will be survivors and victims here amongst us in the chamber and listening to our debate online today. Therefore, as always, can I encourage us to use our words carefully as we debate and discuss these important topics this afternoon. It is a privilege to have Jane Chavu with us this afternoon, who is a survivor of church abuse herself and co-founder of Survivors' Voices. This item will take the form of a presentation in 3 parts. Firstly, we will hear from Jane. Secondly, we will hear from members of the Archbishop's Council. And thirdly, there will be an opportunity for Synod to ask questions of the Archbishop's Council members only. And I'll be taking those questions in 3s, as you would normally expect, including those joining us on Zoom. We will hold a pause for silence at various moments, and we'll end our session in prayer. So first of all, I'd like to invite Jane Chavu to share her presentation to Synod. Thank you.
Thank you, Synod, for allowing me to bring the voice of survivors into the chamber, and I'm mindful of those present and those watching. I'd like to thank the former members of the Independent Safeguarding Board, and in particular Jasvinder and Steve, for doing what you asked them to do, to hold the Church to account, publicly if needs be, for any failings which are preventing good safeguarding practice from happening, the mission statement on their website. As they are no longer able to fulfil this role, I want to highlight a recent failing, one so disastrous that it's already been reported as a serious incident to the Charity Commission. After the interim chair was appointed to the ISB in March, survivors expressed their concern that there is a conflict of interest with the role of chair of the National Safeguarding Panel, and that the appointment happened without due process. This resulted in 76 survivors refusing permission for their data to be shared with the interim chair, but the council did not listen. At the council meeting on the 9th of May, the 3 ISB members gave their views of the way forward, and I was able to bring a survivor view that many had confidence in Jasvinder and Steve. Council stated that they remain committed to proper independent scrutiny in safeguarding and take very seriously the views of both the ISB and survivors. But the council did not listen. At 12:03 on June the 21st, they sacked the board with no risk management or interim plan in place. At 12:42, Steve Reeves emailed the council to advise, "I am urging caution as powerfully as I can. The harm could be significant and the announcement is not urgent. But the council did not listen. For as we learnt this weekend, getting the papers prepared for Synod was more important than the lives of survivors. At 12:17 that day, excuse me. At 12:17 that day, Jasvinder contacted me to share the devastating news. I felt like my whole world had crumbled around me. I trusted the ISB. I had hope. And now that hope had been snatched from me and trampled underfoot. At 13:07, the NST emailed to inform me. I had already seen the media reports and had been contacting other survivors who were as stunned and shocked as I was. All ongoing independent reviews were immediately paused with no support or interim arrangements in place. Survivors are still waiting to discover, as no ISB exists anymore, who is commissioning the reviews? Who will sign off the reviewer's report? Who will be responsible for ensuring the recommendations are implemented? The impact is not just on the 10 survivors with ongoing or pending reviews, and Mr. X with the completed review waiting for his recommendations to be implemented. It affects all survivors watching, waiting, hoping for independent scrutiny and accountability. Many survivors have contacted me to say the church feels unsafe. In their words, what an absolute mess and carnage for everyone. How this could have happened with an appropriately regulated organisation. They've disbanded the only safety I have. My anxiety is through the roof and I'm struggling to function on a day-to-day level. I haven't felt safe since the announcement. My trust in the institutional church is now completely shattered. It's not just trust. The most difficult part is the lack of care. How can the church be like this? The damage done is beyond words. For some, it will be the last straw and cause irreparable damage, not just to their relationship with the church, but in their lives, their well-being, and their faith. It's not just the impact of the reputational damage, the further trauma to victims. It's the wider church feeling complicit in this, which is a moral injury in itself. The safety of the church has been impacted directly, now and for the future. If council members say today, we are listening to survivors and we are committed to full independence, you will understand me if I say I don't believe them. In her report on survivor experience, Don't Panic, Be Pastoral, Jasvinder quoted Archbishop Justin Welby, "Survivors must come first. The church has to get it right. There are no excuses for us getting it wrong." Council, I hope you will hang your heads in shame at those words, as you could not have got it more wrong, and survivors have paid the price. Survivors are asking, where is the accountability for this disaster? Who is going to resign? This is a safeguarding and governance failure which should be properly audited with accountability to Synod for what is needed to ensure it can never happen again. In my petition, which already has nearly 400 signatures, I conclude that Council have shown they are not fit to manage church safeguarding. It's time to take safeguarding out of their hands. We are calling on the Charity Commission to intervene and ensure that a truly independent body is set up that survivors can trust without interference from the church. Whatever happens now, it must not re-traumatise. There should be immediate care and support for the survivors with open cases and action to ensure they are completed. I believe the only workable and compassionate option is for Jasvinder and Steve to be asked to do this, because they already have the trust of survivors, the knowledge of the cases, and they are the data holders. There must be fully independent scrutiny that the church cannot block or interfere with. This must be developed through an open and transparent process with survivors. And some survivors want a suitable professional and fully independent body to be tasked with leading this process. And Council, please, whatever you do, do not make a hasty announcement today. Don't re-traumatise us again. Survivors must be involved in plans for their reviews. This is not just about safeguarding. This is about love, care, and the gospel. A survivor writes, "I have not heard either of the archbishops articulate their sadness about the lack of love, compassion, or care with which this has been handled within the love of God. That saddens and angers me most, and I want to turn my back on the church." Synod, do not turn your back on survivors. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Before I invite the Archbishop of York to introduce the presentation of the members of the Archbishop's Council, can I just invite Synod to hold a moment silent with me in lieu of what we've just heard before we proceed. Thank you. We now come to part 2 of this section, presentation by members of the Archbishop's Council. So can I invite those members, please, to come forward? I now call the Archbishop of York to introduce this section. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Synod. Could I begin, first of all, by thanking Jane for being with us this afternoon. Obviously, for some of us, it's painful to hear what she said, but I do thank her for her honesty and her clarity and it gives me an opportunity to express my own profound sadness of where we find ourselves. This is not where any of us want to be, and we intend this afternoon in the things we share to be as undefended as we can. First of all, acknowledging that we have made mistakes and that there are things we wished had been done differently. But we are in a difficult place, and we also hope, actually quite inspired by the things Jane was saying towards the end of her presentation about how we're going to move forward. I also want to take this opportunity of thanking, I can't see where they are, but I think Jasvinder and Steve and possibly Meg Munn are here. So I want to take this opportunity of thanking them for the work they have done and for the good things that have happened through the ISB. Thank you. You won't be surprised to hear, Synod, that I wish I wasn't sitting here having to say this, but it is important that we, the Archbishop's Council, take responsibility for the decisions we've made, and you, the Synod, deserve to hear the story of where we've got to and why. And then, of course, we will receive your questions and answer them as fairly and as honestly as we can. And we also hope that what you will hear from us is our determination to move forward, though I fully understand that some will find that hard to believe, but we'll say more of that later. These are the three things we want to do in this relatively short presentation. First of all, I'm going to ask Tim to tell the story of why we've got to where we've got to. Then I'm going to ask Alison to speak about the important issue that Jane has already raised about interim arrangements, acknowledging that actually in some of the announcements that were made by myself as well as others in the immediate aftermath of this decision weren't as clear as they should be, in fact may have been unintentionally a little misleading. So Alison will share about that, and then we'll move to Jamie, who will speak about what we are intending to do next. The last thing from me, I'll make a few final comments at the end of this short presentation before we open up for questions. But the other thing I want to emphasize is that we do take collective responsibility for this as the Archbishop's Council. Yes, we wish we weren't here, but we have proceeded all along in the knowledge that we are working with people of goodwill and in the belief that we do all want the same thing, but we acknowledge that we have failed to get there. And the decisions that we took in getting here were unanimous. I want you to know, Synod, though I can't make you believe me, but I want you to know that the decisions we took were some of the most painful decisions I've ever had to be part of in my life and work, but we took them believing them to be the right decisions for the safeguarding of the Church. Could we have communicated them better? Could things have been different in the past? Well, they're things we will discuss, and they are certainly things that we have to learn from. But I do want you to know that our concern has always been for the safeguarding of the Church. And now I will ask my three colleagues to give their short presentations, and then we look forward to your questions. Tim.
Thank you very much, Archbishop Stephen. And I just want to concur with everything that he has said. My brief for this presentation is to share on behalf of the Archbishop's Council a short history of the ISB and provide Synod with a resume of what has brought us to this moment. In late 2020, the Archbishop's Council proposed an independent safeguarding board to provide independent external oversight and scrutiny of the Church's safeguarding work. The proposal, put together with survivors, was always to be understood in two distinct phases. Phase 1, which was really a stage en route to stage 2, could be established quickly, for it required no new legal entity or legislation. It offered operational independence, but it fell upon the Archbishop's Council to provide its governance. Whereas Phase 2, which sought to achieve full independence with full independent governance, would probably involve the creation of a new body which might require powers underpinned by legislation. And the Church Commissioners agreed to fund the ISB Phase 1 up to December 2023. The three appointed members of the ISB, the Chair, Dr. Maggie Atkinson, Survivor Advocate Jasvinder Sangera, and the third member, Steve Reeves, were individually contracted to the Archbishop's Council and contracted then to work together. They were free to choose what aspects of church policy and practice to scrutinize and to offer what observations and recommendations they wished to share. They were also responsible for the development of the second phase of the ISB in consultation with others in the Church. The Archbishop's Council had the governance responsibility for monitoring, managing the expenditure of the ISB, thus ensuring the appropriate use of charity funds, in this case, the funds offered by the Church Commissioners. From the beginning, the Archbishop's Council were concerned at the lack of collegiality expressed within the ISB's working relationship and a lack of clarity about the ISB's priorities. The ISB's primary objective was to help the Church improve its safeguarding practice by examining policy and practice across the whole Church. But as time passed, the ISB focused more on individual cases and survivor support, both vital aspects of their work, but in doing so, neglected the primary objective, which was the scrutiny of our national safeguarding system. There were also concerns raised that initiatives were being started or proposed without adequate planning, budget, terms of reference, preparation, or clarity of outcomes. The Archbishop's Council frustratingly found itself focusing more and more time discussing governance issues within the ISB and relations within and with the ISB in the 5 board meetings between September 2022 and May 2023 than it spent discussing all other vital safeguarding issues, and still without any sign of a rigorously thought-through proposal for Phase 2. This was partly because back in August 2022, the chair, Dr. Maggie Atkinson, stepped back from her role pending investigation of alleged data breaches. In an instant, the ISB lost a third of its board. The subsequent investigation took far longer than envisaged, but towards the end of the year, the two other members of the ISB refused to meet with the chair to discuss whether or not she could resume her role, contravening their contract to work together. It took the issue of a dispute notice by Archbishop's Council to force Jasvinder and Steve to meet with the chair to see if there was any chance of rebuilding their working relationship. Dr. Maggie Atkinson subsequently resigned on the 30th of March 2023, and Meg Nunn, the independent chair of the National Safeguarding Panel, was appointed acting chair until the end of 2023. A large number of survivors were very vocal in their criticism of the appointment of the acting chair. And though initially Jasvinder and Steve issued a statement welcoming the appointment, it was brought to the Council's attention that both Jasvinder and Steve were now refusing to meet with the acting chair. The Archbishop's Council therefore invited all members of the ISB to the Council Board meeting on the 9th of May, where they were each invited to present to the board. The ISB's working relationship was still at an impasse, and so it was agreed that members of the Archbishop's Council, including Archbishop Stephen, would meet with Jasvinder and Steve in early June to seek a way through. But ahead of that meeting, Jasvinder and Steve issued the Council with a dispute notice, criticising the appointment of the acting chair, briefed the press before then meeting with the Archbishop's Council's members. Despite further attempts to resolve the dispute, it was agreed by the Council that the breakdown in the relationship was now sadly beyond repair. And so on the 21st of June, the Archbishop's Council released a statement announcing that they were giving notice that the contracts of the ISB members were being terminated.
Tim, thank you very much. I'm now going to ask Alison to speak about interim arrangements.
Thank you, and my thanks too to Jane. In all of our discussions as an Archbishop's Council, and I think you get a flavour of how very difficult these conversations were, we talked often about the impact on survivors. And we have been concerned to ensure that those survivors who had agreed independent case reviews, that they could be confident that those reviews were being progressed. Our understanding was that there were 6 of those case reviews. I understand from Jane now that there are 10, and this perhaps illustrates one of our issues, our practical problems, that the Council does not, and nor should it know, who those individuals are, and we don't have access to their data. So we initially set out some practical proposals which have been outlined in GS MISC 1341, which you have, to ask the ISB to set in place interim arrangements. We then reflected that to simply offer an option without proper consultation with survivors and their advocates would not be the right way forward. We do understand that our original plan, which had been to ask in each instance one of a small team of diocesan safeguarding advisory panel chairs to work with each survivor to identify a reviewer from a pool of identified possibilities, that this would not be acceptable to some survivors. And we want to respect their wishes, and we do understand that we need to find an alternative that they will be content with. We are therefore just beginning conversations to work collaboratively with survivors and their advocates to find a trusted third-party organisation to set up and manage this process independently for those who'd prefer this option. We recognise the urgency of moving on for those who are waiting for case reviews, but also recognise the need to only move forwards in a way that has the agreement of victims and survivors waiting for reviews. And this is the work that is happening at the moment.
Thank you, Alison. At this point, perhaps could I reiterate my apology that anything that I or others may have said in the immediate aftermath of the announcement was misleading. As Alison, I think, has explained, I think we are now addressing this matter in a way that is appropriate. And thank you for sharing that, Alison. So thirdly, I'm turning to Jamie, who will speak about what we believe needs to happen next.
First, I need to say thank you so much, Jane, and also thank you to Jasvinder and Steve, and my deepest regrets that I'm sitting here having to make this speech. This is a speech which inevitably will be fairly brief in relation to the future, and I think questions will try and help us to dig down a bit more into this. But I want to give you a very brief overview of some of the key issues, I think, which the future has to work with and deal with and sort. Picking up Jane's point about this completely independent body, however we define it and design it. So my 4 areas for looking at are what I call pace or speed, scope, method and independence. So firstly about pace. We've talked about ISB 1, phase 1. We're now talking about ISB 2 or phase 2. Now, of course, it needs to come into being as soon as possible, maximum speed, but equally, there must be the time for the full sort of consultation with victims and survivors, as James reminded us, with the NST, dioceses, cathedrals, and external experts who can help us to do the designing. So there's a very difficult balance between going forward as quickly as possible, but also going with great care and an extensive process of consultation. Slower, but not too slow. Secondly, scope of such a board or organisational structure. Now, the leading safeguarding solicitor, Richard Scorer, recently said, the Church of England needs independent scrutiny and complaints processes in relation to safeguarding, and I completely agree with him, a fully independent complaints and scrutiny process. Now, complaints, which is a very broad term, would include mechanisms to gather and respond to significant complaints, the power to investigate, to have inquiries, case reviews, and other matters of a similar nature that require change on the ground, but also reflect what has happened and why it shouldn't have happened and what can be done about it. It's what we might call a quasi-ombudsman function. In many ways, that's been part of the function so far of ISB 1. But then the term scrutiny, I think, is more complicated. And the question that I want to have answered by any external body is, how safe is the whole church today? And then tomorrow to ask that same question, how do I know, can you tell me as an external body, how safe is the church today? And how can we, with you, make it safer? So, scrutiny involves surveillance, scanning, auditing, accountability, and quality assurance. But I believe it must be a whole system approach, proactive, alert, using what Baroness Honora Neal calls clever accountability, finding out what on the ground actually matters rather than what we think might matter. It must be alert to the greatest risk and find ways to do deep dives and monitoring where the risk is greatest. And we need to note that no national system in health, social care, or education gets it completely right, whether you're talking about the Care Quality Commission, which I used to work for, CQC, or Ofsted, which many of you will be familiar with, or other bodies that seek to look at systems and how they fail or don't fail. So we need to note that these regulation-based systems of inspection alone have significant limitations and are extremely expensive. But that should not stop us considering it. We should not bring finance into the calculation. Thirdly, method. As noted, inspection regimes have their limitations, and I used to do them. And we've got a very large and complicated set of organisations, 16,000 churches, TEIs, cathedrals, chaplaincies, and so on, dioceses. There's great breadth and complexity. And what we want to know is that our systems fail safe, not, as we sometimes used to call it in risk management, the Swiss cheese effect, where people fall down through all the holes, and then it's too late. And finally, this very difficult word we need to work on today, the word independence. So I agree completely with Jane and with Richard Scorer. A fully independent safeguarding complaints and scrutiny body, independent from the church financially, operationally its own legal entity. It should be completely separate, but also need its own external accountability structures to know that it itself is working properly and equally to inform us of what's going on. Here in the Synod and in the Council, we need to know, but we are not the accountability structure for that particular body. And clearly we need good leadership from outside to help us, experts, people who've been there before, people who understand the complexity of systems and how you make them safe. And such a system must engage with culture and leadership and organisational design, business processes, staff skills, as well as understanding complexity of each and every setting in the church. This is no easy solution, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, and we must try to get it right, to find careful design and testing, but also to avoid a burdensome bureaucratic process based on inquiries and investigations alone. I think of the 2013 Francis report on mid-staff's NHS Trust, which I had something to do with afterwards, or the 2001 Kennedy report on paediatric cardiac surgery in Bristol. And yet we still see both of those areas in recent days coming up for very serious scrutiny in other parts of the NHS, which have failed badly. And when Robert Francis was asked very recently about that, he said, yes, I can see it happening again. So the church must have a system. It must be capable of being stress-tested in real time. To answer my question, how do I know how safe the church is today, and how can I make it safer?
Thank you, Jamie. And before we open up or return to the chair for questions, can I just stress three things from what Jamie has said, or from what we've said in this presentation as we look forward. First, we have referred this to the Charity Commission as ourselves, which is an acknowledgement that we recognise things have gone wrong and there are things to learn. So I can't remember the date we did that, but we did that very shortly after the decision was 26th of June. Secondly, and this does relate to a following motion that may be before us tomorrow, we think there should be a review of what has happened, an independent review, and a report back to Synod in November. And we intend to put that in process. But thirdly, I think probably the most important learning for me personally and for us as a council, and I do believe for us as a Synod, and this is a watershed moment for us. We can't get this wrong again. We, the Archbishop's Council, we, the General Synod, we, the Church of England, can no longer think that we can deliver these things ourselves. That I think, is the key learning. not only do we need independent oversight and scrutiny of safeguarding, we need independent help in deciding how best to do it, which I think is what Jane was saying to us. I can't tell you how sorry I am that it's taken this long for us to see it with such clarity. But we need independent scrutiny, but we need independent help in deciding how best to do it and implementing it once it is decided.
Thank you.
And this is now our determination. Thank you.
Thank you. So we now come to Synod's opportunity to ask questions of the Archbishop's Council. We will leave it to them to decide which of the panel answers those questions. I'll take questions in batches of 3, alternately from the room and to Zoom, so do be prepared to raise your hand on Zoom, please. To ensure that we can progress as quickly as possible, and I know many of you would like to ask questions, can I ask those of you asking questions to do just that, and to do so as quickly and succinctly as you can, and also to remind members of the panel, encourage you to be disciplined in the length of your answers in the time that we have. Thank you. And so I'd now like to take the first 3 questions. Those indicating, please show. Thank you. Yes, person in the pink dress. And Gavin Drake, thank you. And person on the end with the pink dress. Thank you.
Ruth Newson, Leeds 137. Do you think that Synod members who have called this a crisis of governance rather than a crisis of safeguarding have a point?
Thank you.
Gavin Drake, Sutherland, Nottingham 421. I will get straight to the question after I've just said thank you to the panel. This is hard. Our concerns are with what's happened, not with you as individuals, and I think that needs to be said. My question is, what was the process of appointing Dr. Maggie Atkinson? And by that I mean, who selected her and who made the appointment? And then what was the process for appointing Meg Munn as interim chair? Who made the selection and who made the appointment? Thank you.
Thank you. 2 questions.
Nadine Daniels, 347 Liverpool. I want to echo what Gavin's just said. This isn't personal. But when you have lost the trust of the room, you need to send it out for an independent inquiry. And my question is, why can't you follow what the L'Arche community did in similar circumstances? Hold up your hands and say, we have failed, we have made a mistake. Commission an independent inquiry report from one person that springs to mind is Sir Mark Headley. And then act as L'Arche did on all the recommendations, accept all the recommendations and act on them. That is my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Members of the Archbishop's Council to respond.
Thank you very much for the questions. For the first one, is this a crisis of governance rather than a crisis of safeguarding? Clearly this has created a crisis for safeguarding. I don't want to underestimate that in any way, but I think it's a point well made that I think, I know hindsight's a wonderful thing, but I look back and think the way this was set up lacked the clarity that it should have had, that it, in a desire to move quickly, I think mistakes have been made, and we do need to review that and learn from them and do our very best to make sure they don't happen again. I don't think it could have been foreseen how things became difficult and went wrong very, very quickly with the need for the first chair to step aside. You know, that was a tragedy that couldn't have been foreseen. but I think it's a point well made. For the second question about the appointment processes themselves of the chair and then the interim chair, I'm going to turn to Jamie.
Thank you, Gavin. As always, startlingly good question. I think my understanding, and I may be corrected, so I don't want to be quoted completely on this one, is that Maggie Atkinson was a group of people, including survivors, were involved in that appointment. But I don't know the full details. We'll have to tell you later and publish that. Regarding Meg Munn, who was, as you know, the independent chair of the National Safeguarding Panel, which was an appointment made by significant survivor input. The feeling at that stage was we were reaching a point where we had to move things much faster forward and gain greater capacity to go to phase 2. All the time the concern was the slowness of the process. This was adding in extra capacity, particularly to do that. In the event, it didn't work, and we're very sorry about that.
Thank you. With the chair's indulgence, I'll ask Tim and Alison to say something briefly about the final question.
Briefly, go ahead.
I hope that you have heard clearly that we also wish for an independent review. We also want to really learn the lessons, and we desperately do not want this to happen again.
Yes, Nadine, we have failed, we have got it wrong, and we are very sorry, and we don't want it to happen again.
Thank you. To now take the next 3 questions, please. Sean Doherty, thank you. Yes, spotty dress, thank you. And the stripy shirt, thank you.
EIs 450. It's a question for Archbishop Stephen. Archbishop, you spoke a few times, used the phrase, the safeguarding of the church. Now that could be interpreted as protecting the church, which is of course how it has, that's often how we've been perceived and how we've sometimes acted and harmed survivors that way. I assume you mean, I hope you mean, the safeguarding work of the church in protecting and helping those who need it. But I just thought it would be helpful for survivors to be able to hear you clarify that. Thanks.
Thank you. Morwenna Ludlow, Exeter 120. My question is about governance and whether the Archbishop's Council is intending to reflect on previous theological work that has been done on governance and confidentiality. And I'm thinking in particular of the O'Donovan review on the CNC, where O'Donovan specifically commented on the way in which a group of people can sometimes move from a culture of confidentiality to a culture of secrecy. And my point here is that one can think that one is holding other people's secrets, when in fact what is happening is that there is a lack of transparency, and transparency always lies in the eyes of the beholder. Thank you.
Hi, Alex Frost, 68, Blackburn. Just a straightforward question, I suppose. In an institution that is built around Jesus' words to put the most vulnerable people first, in the words of the Beatitudes, I'd like to ask, particularly the Archbishop, what do you think Jesus would make of what is going on here? Thank you.
Can I remind Synod members the questions are for the Archbishop's Council rather than just to the Archbishop. Thank you.
But yes, I'm very happy to answer Alex's question. I imagine Jesus weeps over this situation where we have been. I don't believe there's a payoff between justice and mercy. We humans fail, but God alone is just and merciful, and and I look to his justice and his mercy in this situation as I do in all situations. But right now I expect he's weeping, and I know many of us are not far from those tears as well. But the other thing is, because this is about justice as well as mercy, then we also need to find a way forward that will not erase the mistakes, difficulties and challenges of the past, but will build a better future. And that is what we're committed to. Just before handing to Jamie, I think the other question was also, I took as an entirely friendly and helpful question, Sean. I do apologise if what I was saying was misinterpreted. I am absolutely saying I want our church to be a safe place, and it is the independent oversight and scrutiny that is needed to hold us to account and enable us to be as safe as we can for all people.
Sorry, Chair, I'm going to say something. Basically, I think we've got three responsibilities, areas of accountability as a trustee body. First and primary is to the victims and survivors of past events. I'm responding to the question around governance. We've got huge responsibility to them. We've heard exactly why that is today. We also have a very significant responsibility to all the people who come into our churches across the whole of the Church of England, whether they're members of the church or visiting the church or using our facilities, whether it be dementia cafes or children's groups and so on. And thirdly, we have a significant responsibility to those who work with us as staff members and as people who are in parishes and dioceses working safeguarding. So I think the issue of vulnerability is really important, but I think we have to note that vulnerability is across the whole system, and one part what we were concerned about was to make sure that we understood that and were able to respond to it appropriately.
Thank you. I'm now going to look to Zoom to see if anybody has the opportunity to ask a question. No, back in the chamber, 3 questions. Oh, 1. Wasn't very quick. Martin. Robert Thompson to ask a question, followed by Martin Seeley. Sewell, apologies, and Jane Ozanne. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, for calling me. And thank you to the members of the Archbishop's Council for taking these questions, and indeed to Jane for addressing the Synod, which was really profound and moving. I'm glad that Stephen has raised that there will be an independent review into what has taken place, and that Tim also referred to that. I'm not quite clear what it is, though, that we're exactly looking into. So I'd like to know about the terms of reference and the scope of that. It seems to me that one of the issues that many of us are really concerned with at present is that we have 2 sets of narratives which are coming out now about the end of the ISB itself before we get to safeguarding in general. None of us know which one of these to believe, and we need a clarification of facts simply as members of Synod. That's the first issue. And the second relates also to the issue that I raised in relation to the Business Committee debate about the role of the Secretary-General, and also, given Justin Welby's answer to Sam Margrove's question yesterday, also Justin's place in this. It seems to me that there's accusations that the Secretary-General has skewed facts on one particular level, and he needs to have himself cleared of that. But many of us in the chamber feel that Justin may well have lied in Synod yesterday, and that also.
Can you ask the question, please?
That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you for Martin Sewell, Rochester 390. Thank you for calling me, Chair. We're hearing that the dismissed ISB members were 2-day-a-week contractors with terms of reference to focus on survivor engagement. It's quite important to remember that. We also learned that Archbishop's Council chose not to exercise their power to appoint additional members during the 8 months that Maggie Atkinson was stood back. Far too long. Do you seriously attempt to blame, or should I say frame, the independent members with responsibility for delays in conceptualising phase 2 of the ISB?
Thank you, Jane.
Hosanna, Oxford 380. Thanks for calling me Chair. Disclosure, I speak as a victim of clergy abuse and abuse in church, which has ended me in hospital. And the nature of abuse is that it involves power and abuse. And that is what we have seen, sadly, many of us as survivors from the Archbishop's Council, a group in power who have taken abusive decisions, or so it feels. And for me, that then brings up the question of governance, as we've touched on. But my ultimate question is to whom is the Archbishop's Council accountable? Because there was a whole, if I can just because there's a whole process of events that have happened, and if this had had an accountability body, both the ISB and the Council could have gone to that accountable body.
Thank you for your question, Jane.
Thank you. So I think Tim's going to respond to Robert's question.
Just regarding the terms of reference for the review, one of the reasons why we are so supportive of an independent review is we want to hear the stories of all parties, that all parties can hear, because what we want is for the church to learn from the mistakes that have been made. So that would mean we would want to hear in that review from also Jasvinder and from Steve, from survivors, from the Archbishop's Council, from everybody involved, so that we can truly learn the mistakes of what has happened, and that, like we have said already, this does not happen again.
Thank you. And just to finish that off, I think that will help to inform us as well as we go forward, and we must look to the future. Martin, I want to say that we do not blame Steve and Jasvinder. We thank them for their work, much of which, well, all of which was excellent and good. What became clear was that there was a breakdown in our understanding of that work. Archbishop Stephen has already alluded to the fact that the terms of reference were probably not as they should have been. And so we found ourselves sort of going on diverging paths. And with that, that put a strain on our working relationship, which Tim has explained to you. But we're not blaming them. We take the blame ourselves in that. In any breakdown in relationship, there are two sides. And so I want to hold up our hands too and say, I'll pass back to Tim.
I mean, I would want to say, any breakdown of relationship, we did not look after you. We did not actually build the relationships that we needed to build. And that's a responsibility we all took. The challenge we had was, and I talked about this in my reply yesterday, was the tension between governance and operational independence. And it responds to you, Martin, as well. I would say there were many times we did not get that balance right. Absolutely. We either erred too much on governance, and that felt like interfering, or we gave too much operational independence. But we did not get that balance right, and that is a governance issue, which I hold my hand up for.
I think at this point I just want to reiterate the learning that I think I've certainly taken, I think all of us have taken from this, is that we need an independent safeguarding board. The phase 2 we always imagined and hoped would be, but we need to stop thinking that we can be the ones who deliver it. That will be the big step change. With regard to the second part of Robert Thompson's question, I think I just again want to reiterate something I said earlier. The decision that was taken, painful though it was taken because we believe in the medium term it will be the best way of providing what the church needs in terms of scrutinising and overseeing the safeguarding of the whole church in its ministry to everyone. But this was a collective decision, and it was a unanimous decision. As I think has come out, there may have been some disagreements around timings, because this was a sensitive issue, but they were not disagreements about the decision itself.
Thank you, Jane. It's a fundamental question who the Archbishop's Council is accountable to. I suppose one answer is ultimately the Charity Commission as trustees. I think the other issue, which of course we're struggling with in governance generally in the review, is how does this synod relate to the council in terms of accountability? You elect over half of us onto the council, and we have a certain level of functionality there. So it's how we work out our relationship with you and how you hold us accountable. But ultimately, I think technically it's the Charity Commission.
And I simply note there is a debate this evening, which is, you know, I mean, it is relevant to this debate that I think many of us realise that our governance structures could be a lot better than they are, and all of us therefore sometimes find ourselves in places where we are not either sure or happy with how things are being done. I think there's been widespread acknowledgement of that. Why else would we be having the debate we're having this evening?
Thank you. Next 3 questions. Sam Margrave, Simon Butler, and the gentleman at the... Yes, you. Thank you. No, not you. Sorry. Yes, the gentleman behind you. Yes. No. Yeah, you. No, not you, Matt. Sorry. I'm really sorry. I'm so bad at the... No. Okay. The gentleman with glasses and the check shirt, who's given me the thumbs up, that is you. Please come down. Thank you. Apologies. Sam Margrave.
Sam Margrave, Coventry 295. Booing is not the culture of listening to valid accusations and poor governance, Synod. You need to act on accusations, not dismiss them, so I don't expect to be booed. At question time, I asked how the Archbishops voted. My question was very clear. The Archbishop of Canterbury responded to the question, how did the Presidents vote, by saying both Archbishops had wished to wait a bit. This wasn't challenged by the Archbishop of York. However, after great journalism by the Church Times, we found out the vote was unanimous, confirmed today by the Archbishop. I've written to the Secretary-General and Clerk asking them to come before this Synod. I'm getting to my question, and to address Synod today and to take questions. Will the Archbishop's Council arrange this, and will you send members of Synod minutes and reports used to make the decision, and also commission a report into lying, and take accountability in who will be resigning for the misleading that was knowingly done? Thank you.
Thank you. Simon, thank you.
Simon Butler, Southwark 221. Firstly, disclosure, I was a member of the Archbishop's Council in 2020 when the decisions were taken, so I bear some responsibility for the early decisions. I just want to say one thing before I ask my question, Chair. I am aware, and I think it's just important for full disclosure, because of all of that, that the survivor voice is present in the Archbishop's Council because members of the Council themselves are survivors. And I think that ought just to be borne in mind in some of the conversation we're having. I asked Tim on Friday about the issue looking to the future about better governance, and particularly with the issue that arose of having just 3 members of the ISB. In ISB 2, what steps will we take to ensure that there is a much bigger and therefore less swayable governance structure in the future?
Thank you.
Thank you. Douglas, Birmingham 064. You did report that Jasvinda and Steve didn't want to work with the interim chair. Were you made aware of the reasons why? And also, secondly, were you given any reasons why also they raised a dispute notice against the Archbishop's Council?
Thank you.
I mean, I think we have answered Sam's question, so I'm not intending to say any more on that one, if you don't mind.
So this is in response to Simon's question. I think when we look back to 2020, 2021, when decisions were made, I think we need to take into account the context of coming out of COVID. And at the time, we were also looking at cuts in the NCIs of the transforming effectiveness stream that was happening at the same time, finding £2 million worth of cuts. So there was a pressure on the number of people we could employ on the board. We chose 3, and that, I believe, proved really problematic for them and for us, because I think a board of 3 to function well is dependent on good collegiality. And we became concerned about that good collegiality when there was a vote early on of standing orders on that board that decisions would be made by votes 2-1. And our concern then was the potential of actually splitting that board into 2, the 1 person and then the 2 who voted otherwise. So there was concerns about the collegiality. I do urge that in any future board, that it is 5, 6, 7, because you need that breadth of voice on the board, so that actually every single voice can be better heard.
I think Archbishop has already said that we need external advice to advise us as we set up ISB2. So I'm looking for that, really, to hear from other people how many people should be on the board.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said, it's vital that we understand from expertise elsewhere how other similar systems have been set up. I mean, normally, if you set up a regulatory body, it's the Act of Parliament that sets it up, whether it's CQC, Ofsted, or General Medical Council and so on. So we were in a bit new territory trying to do this. I think we proved that it was extremely difficult, that we failed, and for that we're deeply regretful. But equally, I think, Simon, we shouldn't preempt what the structure will be. That suggests, again, we're just closing down options without, again, proper consultation from a whole range of people. On the question around the dispute notice, I think I answered that question in one of the questions. Obviously, we want to know from the ISB why they did it. We don't really know, but I think it's reasonable to assume that it was around the Meg Munn appointment. But as I say, it's fundamental that the review we set up goes into all these so that everyone can know the answers. Because we're just giving you our side of this. I mean, and that's all we can do.
Thank you. Point of order.
Thank you, Chair, and I apologise for interrupting the flow. Clive with an S, 306, Diocese in Europe. May I draw to the Chair's attention that under paragraph 19.2 of Standing Orders, if a member wishes to correct an important misunderstanding of fact concerning either that member or what another member has said, the member may interrupt a speech to make a point of personal explanation, but may only do so with the consent of the Chair. May I ask you this afternoon, because many remarks have been made and have named Ms Sangera and Mr Reeves personally here today, may I ask you to consider extending the powers of Standing Order paragraph 19.2 to invite them at some point to respond, subject to time limits chosen by yourself, before this synod. Thank you.
I'll just take some advice. Thank you. I have no power to go beyond what the standing order provides. Thank you for raising it, though. We'll have next 3 questions. Point of order.
Gavin Drake, Sutherland, Nottingham, 421. With apologies, I have the standing orders in front of me. I don't have the number at hand. I'm looking for it. There is a standing order that allows for the suspension of standing orders. Can I propose that we do that in order to give you the power to invite the 2 ISB members to speak?
Bear with me. Okay. So a member does have the right to move that a standing order may be suspended with my consent. Do we have a member willing to say which standing order they wish to suspend, and then we need to vote on that, and we will need 75% of the House to vote in favour of that. So I am looking to you, I think. You can't speak again, apparently. Bear with me. Sure. You need to call somebody else to speak on your behalf on this matter. Whilst you're looking into that, we'll continue to the next 3 questions, please. Mindful of time, we may have time for one more batch of questions. We are already running slightly over, but don't have timed business, but we do have other business to do. So I'm going to call Caroline Herbert, lady with the stripy shirt, thank you. Another one. And thank you. Yes, madam, thank you.
Caroline Herbert, Norwich 371. Thank you, everyone, for what we've heard so far this afternoon. There's been a couple of mentions of a consultation going forward about phase 2. And I wondered if it's possible to hear a little more about that, who will be leading on it, who will be deciding who to consult, and how that can be perhaps more independent, getting more voices into that process. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jane Roseham, Rochester 389. My question is, if judges recuse themselves if there is a risk that a reasonable member of the public might have a perception of bias, when 76 survivors objected to the appointment of Meg Munn as chair of the ISB on the basis of a perceived conflict of interest, did you and she regard those 76 survivors as not reasonable members of the public?
Julie Connolty, 51, Northern Suffragans. Somebody forgot to tell me that apparently bishops aren't meant to ask questions, but anyway, here we are. I'm a little concerned we might be losing survivor focus here. So I have a really practical question. For those survivors who feel they've lost hope and are really in a desperate situation now because they'd pinned their hopes on the ISB, what exactly is happening and what is available and what more can we do?
Thank you.
To Caroline Herbert. Again, I think we don't want to jump the gun on this. It needs, as I said, pace. It needs speed to work out who the people should be in the room and not in the room on Zoom to help us to construct this next stage. I'm very concerned that we have not done this in the past and we've not done it well. So in a sense, that's why I tried to say the difference between speed and significant speed, but also not going so fast we don't get the right consultation. We have contacts with a number of independent organisations, for instance, the organisations that have done audits for us in the past, and PCR2, and I think we're already in conversation with a number of people, and at this stage I can't say who they are because they have not agreed as yet to participate.
Julie, so we seem to have missed someone out. Have we missed out a question? Jane. Can I answer Julie's question and then we'll come back to Jane? Sorry, if that's in my mind. Julie, I wish I could say to you, yes, it's all, we've got it all sewn up, but actually the reality is that we need to take time to have conversations, to consult. And my understanding is that that is the work that is happening now. And I've been talking to Bishop Joanne about that. My colleagues, some of my colleagues had meetings this week, and I think you might be aware of that, with a survivor group and survivors advocate group to hear their point of view. I thank you very much for saying that we'd got to a point where we were not being very survivor focused, and I recognise that sitting here. And I want to say to survivors, and to respond to what Jane said, that actually you must be at the heart of what's happened. And it breaks my heart to hear that you do not feel loved by the church, because we must do that work. I feel that you might be looking at me thinking, well, more mealy words, Alison, you're more talk, less action. I don't know what else I can do now, but I hope that you will believe that is genuinely what I feel in my heart. And I think all of us together need to work out how we can do that better. As I sit here, I don't know the answer to that now. I know it needs to start with conversations, and those are happening, but it needs to move on to something that's more practical and more action-focused. Yeah.
And really important to say, Julie, that consultation will be with survivors. That's really important to stress, with survivors. They are going to be involved. That's something we take very, very seriously going forwards. We've failed in that, and we need to do that better. So that is, I want to say that to you as well.
Yeah, yes. I mean, I think the final part of Jane's speech at the beginning is something that I want to own and reiterate, that what happens next needs to be set up independently. Once agreed, it needs to be implemented independently, and then it needs to operate independently. And in the setting up of that, we will, I can't tell you who's going to do that work now, but we are already beginning to have discussions, and survivors will be part of that. Sorry.
I'm going to read the question to you, Bishop. Archbishop. It was Jane's question about. You come? Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay, get on with it.
Yeah. So the question about Meg Munn and the perception question. So I entirely understand what you're saying, and although I did not conclude myself that there was a conflict of interest, actually that's not relevant. Perception is, if it's perceived as being, then then that's, perception is reality in this sense. I entirely understand that. I think one of the things the Archbishop's Council we need to apologise to Meg Munn, who's been put in a really, really difficult position. It was not our intention at all. However, I do need to note that initially, it gives me no pleasure to say this, but initially, Jasvinder and Steve appeared to welcome Meg's appointment. And actually, because we realised perception is everything and that we couldn't carry on as we are, that was precisely why we were having the meeting. I haven't got the dates in front of me. Is why we were having the meeting, which I believed was going to be a very positive meeting about trying to work out precisely these matters. But unfortunately, for reasons that I understand as what they felt they had to do, but Jasvinder and Steve then took out a dispute notice against the Archbishop's Council about a couple of hours before that meeting was due to take place, and it prevented the meeting from happening, and that was part of the final breakdown of communications, which led us to conclude that we had to approach this a different way. And as I've stressed and want to stress again, part of that different way is actually to take it out of our hands and ask somebody to independently design it, as well as in due course implement it.
Thank you. Point of order, Debbie Buggs.
Under Standing Order 120, the President may invite such persons as they think fit to address this synod. So I ask the Archbishop of York, in his capacity as President, to ask Stephen and Jasvinder to address synod, please.
Thank you.
So I would be happy to do that, but I think if that is going to happen, and I do it because I want us to learn and move forward, but I think Meg Munn is here, and Meg Munn ought to be invited to say something as well. I'm also mindful, I feel in an awkward position, as I'm sure you understand, but I'm also mindful that we have important business on redress. So I think if people were enabled to make a short statement and then perhaps a final response, perhaps from the panel, I'll leave that in your hands, Chair, I think then we should conclude this item. That would be my advice, and perhaps we could conclude it with silence and prayer.
Can we just take a moment, please, and just take some advice before we do that? Thank you. Thank you for your patience. Synod, please bear with us.
It's the president, not one of the presidents.
Can you go and brief him then? Because he's already said it.
say that it was my wish that this was enabled to happen. I don't want them to think I've wriggled out. Yeah, but what I don't want them to think is I've wriggled out on a technicality. So yeah. So could you say that it's it is my wish that this happens, but I have been told that this can't happen, and I regret that. I can reiterate that if you let me have a final comment. Well, that's well. Yeah.
Synod, I apologise for the delay. We have been advised that it is unlawful for one of the presidents, not both, to suspend the standing orders. I also wish to indicate that that is a regret. Well, you heard that the Archbishop of York wished to allow the non-speaking members to speak. There was already a prior point of order over here. Point of order.
Understanding Order 39, may I move the motion that will the Chair give consent for Synod to be tested on the suspension of Standing Order 152, which is that non-members may not address the Synod.
Thank you.
I don't think I need to. I don't think I need 2 minutes to explain why.
We are very fortunate to have so many legal minds in the chamber, aren't we? I am minded, though, I have been reminded that, as such, only those who are able to speak on a presentation may do so if they are not speaking members of Synod, if they are invited by the Business Committee. The Business Committee chair may not do that upon his own accord. So this is a presentation, so bear with me. There is another point of order here, isn't there?
Ruth Abernethy, 407 Channel Islands, Guernsey. My point of order is that we use Standing Order 35 in order to suspend this session for a prescribed amount of time in order to allow a presentation by Jasvinder and Steve and then resume the session.
Thank you. Bear with us a moment.
But, address those who are present in the hall. Yeah, but Stephen.
Thank you for your patience, Synod. If you would bear with us a couple more minutes, we are very much trying to untangle the standing orders in a way which serves what we are all here to do. Thank you. No, bear with a moment, son. We're still in the middle of this one. Synod, if you could please resume your seats. Thank you. Synod, in order to give the space for our speakers, I am adjourning this sitting for 10 minutes for the better conduct of Synod business, to allow those to be heard who need to be. During this time, it will be open to those present in the hall to listen to what Jasvinder and Steve wish to say. The chair of the business committee will kindly facilitate the time on that, as we will need to leave as the sitting will be adjourned. The sitting will resume again at 4:25. Already adjourned, sorry.
Is this... friends, I have never sat in this chair before. All of these things around me are new, so please bear with me. We now have 10 minutes, which I think will take us until about 26 minutes past. And I invite Jasvinder and Steve to come. No, sorry, my suggestion is that we just progress through with, no, please come down. But we progress through without any applause. This is an informal meeting of the members of the General Synod. It is not a General Synod meeting. That means standing orders and everything else do not apply. We will resume in our time the formal meeting. I believe... If the live stream is happening, the live stream can continue. I believe that Steve and Jasvinder have said you'll speak for up to 5 minutes each. So we'll do that. I don't have the option of using a bell or anything, but after 5 minutes, if you wish me to indicate that that is 5 minutes, I will. I suggest that, who wishes to go first? Steve, would you like to come up, and you have 5 minutes?
Good afternoon, everybody. You'll appreciate this wasn't quite expected, so I have some thoughts to share, but they almost certainly won't be fully formed in the way that I would have liked had we had time to prepare this. It's really clear that we would rather not be in this position, and that we're very grateful for the support that we've had from a whole variety of people, many of whom sitting in this room. So for every tweet, WhatsApp, phone call, sincere gratitude, even if we haven't had an opportunity to respond. But of course, this isn't about us. This really isn't about two individuals who have been appointed to a board. It's about this broader approach that the Church adopts for itself when it comes to safeguarding. The Independent Safeguarding Board and the events of the last 18 months or so are a very small part of a very large trajectory in a church that has failed significantly year after year, decade after decade, to do what is due of it to survivors, victims of abuse, and people who potentially could become victims of abuse. The solidarity that people feel with survivors is really significant, and if you go outside and talk to those people, I know that they're very grateful for that. Solidarity works to a degree. Action needs to follow too. Standing in solidarity with people is important, but change is even more important. One of the things that's been most challenging over the last 2 weeks has been hearing from survivors for whom hope is slipping away. They feel that this decision has taken away from them something which they feel they deserve and have fought for a long, long time. What I would say to you, one of the challenges for me, and Jasvinder will speak for herself, is that the meaning of words in this context is very different to the rest of society. It's very clear to me that when the Church or the Archbishop's Council talks about independence, they do not mean independence in the way that you and I and the average person on the street means independence. They mean semi-detached, not independent. When the Archbishop's Council talks about trust, they don't mean the word trust in the same way as we mean the word trust, and people in the street mean the word trust. What they mean is obedience. When they talk about communication, they don't mean communication in the way that the rest of us understand communication, the average person in the street. They mean loyalty. And I challenge you, go back to the public statements that you've heard around this, supplant those words, and the meaning will be clear. The reason we are in this situation is somebody somewhere had a very clear blueprint about what independent safeguarding in the Church of England should look like. They appointed people to develop that. When it started going in a direction that they didn't like or didn't think it met that blueprint, they recoiled. They pulled back. When you talk about wanting to rapidly move towards an independent structure, we presented a path for an independent structure, including an interim arrangement that would allow an independent safeguarding board to exist as a separate legal entity as a matter of pace. We presented that to the Archbishop's Council. Their reaction was to reject those recommendations and impose a chair upon the board in contravention of the terms of reference that they themselves had approved. So if you want to know what the intention of an act is, I've learned over quite a few years, you want to know what the intention of an act is, look at the outcome, look at the impact, and work backwards. So actually somewhere in a desk somewhere is a blueprint of what the powers that be believe independent safeguarding should look like in the Church. The path that we were moving towards, with the solid engagement of survivors and others, clearly didn't meet that objective. What didn't happen was nobody sat down with us and said, we're not comfortable with this path. What they did was they threw up obstacles and obstructions. Some of you will have had the opportunity to telephone the ISB at some point in the last 12 months. But actually, one day we wake up to find our telephone number is disconnected. Just think of that. We had a telephone number where you could ring us. It then gets disconnected. It takes 5 months for that to be reinstated. This is not the action of an organisation that wants to drive towards rapid independent scrutiny, that wants to facilitate the work of those it appoints. There are many, many instances like that we can point to. And when you ask your colleagues on Archbishop's Council what the motivation for that dispute notice was, we've been transparent. The motivation for that dispute notice is listed in the dispute notice. It's very clear where our discontent or our concern about the way in which the Church has operated, the Archbishop's Council has operated. It's very clear. We're not hiding anything. We've been very clear. We were very clear about what it is that our concerns were. I would urge you, I'm conscious that not for lack of politeness, I've gone first today, not least that I and others will know that trying to follow Jasvinder Sanghera is more of a challenge than it should be. So going first is always a safe mechanism. So I thank you for the opportunity. I'm sorry they're not more fully formed thoughts, but we've given the opportunity and we didn't want to miss the opportunity of sharing some thinking with you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thanks for sticking to time. Jasvinder, if I can ask the same thing of you, and I'll indicate when we're just before 5 minutes, if that's okay. Thank you.
I shall do my best. First of all, I want to acknowledge the survivors, especially those that spoke and those in the room, who I've listened to for the past 19 months. When I first met them, they were sceptical of the Independent Safeguarding Board, and so they should be. Why should they trust us? We're part of the Church, they told us. It took us time and effort to earn their trust and their respect, and we achieved that. So thank you for giving us that. Second thing I want to say is it took me courage to come here today. I'm here with my partner. My stomach was churning all morning. You may not know this, but in 2018, when I left the charity I founded, Carmen of Honor, I made the decision, after holding a secret for 12 years, that I was sexually abused and harassed by a very senior member of the peers in the House of Lords. He was a lawyer, and I took on the institution, the House of Lords, and I was told, you'll never dismantle that, nobody's going to listen to you, it's a powerful institution, they look after their own. I still carried on. They had a process. They didn't have a process, but they created one. And sitting up there today, I felt like when I was in the first debate at the House of Lords, when I was ridiculed, they were all speaking about me. They didn't invite me to the table, and I felt like the ghost at the banquet. So I appreciate standing here today. And by the way, that complaint, the second debate, looked very different because Theresa May said the House of Lords will not be allowed to mark its own homework. And now they are very fundamentally committed to it. And I share that with you because I really appreciate the platform to speak. It's been really difficult to sit there and not be allowed to tell our side of the story. And I'm not going to give it justice in a few minutes, and that's the thing, because I haven't had time to prepare. But what I do want to say is this. Me and Steve did not take lightly the decision to serve a dispute notice. The title is Dispute Resolution Notice. Resolution is the word. The Archbishop's Council served a dispute notice on us in February, telling us we were not doing the job we were meant to be doing. And by the way, they didn't tell us. We read it in the press. And then we received the dispute notice 3 days later. It was a last resort to serve the dispute notice, and it tells you clearly, and it wasn't only about Meg Munn's appointment, it was about a number of things. They will tell you we accepted the appointment, and in fact, we went out publicly and we said, welcome Meg. We were told to do that. In the meeting, when we were told Meg was going to be appointed, me and Steve shared our concerns with the General Secretary. We told them she would not be received by survivors because she may be perceived as not being independent. We told them you didn't follow a process like us of open recruitment where we were interviewed by 5 people, 2 were victims and survivors. We told them this, but we were still told, it's Archbishop's Council decision, Jasvinder, you have to accept it. Give a statement. So we did do that. I put my hand up to welcoming Meg. It was never about Meg. It was about doing what was right and following a process. But even then, we continued. We didn't expect the sheer volume of victim survivors writing to us, 76 in total, telling us, please do not share our data with this individual. It was impossible. And we were invited to Archbishop's Council. We shared all our concerns. Jane shared her concerns at that meeting. But the feeling, and I'm somebody that has advocated for victims and survivors for 3 decades, is that you are listening, but you are not actually listening and hearing and acting. That's how it has felt for me as an individual. I have to say that sitting here today and listening and not being given the opportunity and always being told we don't want to read things on social media, Jasvinder, social networking, Twitter, etc. Well, what other platform do we have? At every point we go to, we are silenced. You don't allow us to tell you how it is. I came to this role after 25 years as a CEO, as a founder of a charity, as a survivor of a forced marriage. I looked at the advert and I wanted to make a difference because I saw the church was on a journey and I really wanted to make a difference. And that's why I applied for the role. Today I've listened to people say from Archbishop's Council, they want to invite independent people to do independent work. Isn't that what we were doing, Steve? That is exactly what we were doing. And I now think we were too independent. We did our job too well. And when I'm being told, and Steve's being told that we are too survivor-led and too survivor-focused, I feel the church has a problem. Because actually, you should be welcoming the fact that we have achieved what some of you haven't achieved in that leadership role, and that is gaining the trust and confidence of victim survivors. Why don't you welcome it instead of not welcoming that? So please, read our dispute notice and listen to what we're saying. Because I personally feel a responsibility to those survivors who trusted us with their stories. Those reviews, and let me tell you, when somebody decides to do a review, they are at the dead end of a road. They've been at local dioceses, they've had their stories looked at under a microscope, but they haven't achieved justice, or they haven't been assured that anything has improved. That's when they come to us and say, we want you to look at it. We took months earning their trust, and you've just ripped that away from them. And I urge you to consider these reviews. Do not allow these victims and survivors to have to retell their stories again to new people. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Jasvinder. I think that concludes this informal meeting of members of the General Synod, and I think I now hand back to the chair to continue under the formal meeting of the Synod. Thank you.
And so we resume item 11. Synod, thank you so much for your patience throughout this debate. As you can appreciate, we have taken many twists and turns and quite a bit longer than scheduled, but it's absolutely the right thing to have done, and I'm grateful for your patience. But we do need to safeguard items coming on later the rest of this day. I would like to thank Jane and Jasvinder and Steve and members of the Archbishop's Council for their contributions to this item, and to Synod for the questions. And I now bring this item to a close by inviting you to join me in holding a few moments of silence for all that has been heard. The words of the grace. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all evermore. Amen. Synod, that concludes this item of business. Given how our afternoon has taken a turn, I suggest before we continue our next item that those who wish to take a 5-minute comfort break do that, and the next item will resume in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Simon Friend, Exeter 310. Can I ask that a record of the informal meeting we've just had is attached perhaps as an annex to the formal report of this synod?
I'm advised that that is not really a point of order. However, I'm sure the Business Committee have heard and will consider it. Thank you very much. We come now, Synod, to item 51. You will need GS Miss 1340 for this debate. This item is the Archbishop's Council Audit Committee's annual report. I'm going to be calling on Maureen Cole to speak to item 51. She has up to 10 minutes. Maureen Cole, thank you.
So, Chair and Member of Synods, good afternoon. I'm sure you're going to love this session after that last one, and I'm really conscious of Jasvinder and Steve and others and sharing that story and where we're going now. So I'm just very mindful of that, and thank you for sharing that your information. At your request, we're here to discuss the annual report for the Archbishop's Council Audit Committee. Chair, this speech should be within the 10 minutes allotted time, but I hope with permission that you'll allow me to overrun for a few seconds if necessary, because I want to ensure that General Synod receives the full facts and information. I'm now into my 4th year as Chair of the Audit Committee, and this is my first opportunity to talk about the important work of this committee. Some people think audit is boring. But I'm blessed with committee members who would take issue with that. Our committee comprises of 2 council members to provide link to the Archbishop's Council. That's Ian Paul and myself. And 2 members elected by this synod, Clive Billanes and Chris Gill, and who provide challenge and scrutiny. And there are 2 members who are independent of both bodies, and that's Bethany Burrow and Don McClure. As Chair of the committee, I'm required to prepare an audit and review of the Audit Committee's work during the year up to the 30th of April 2023. Our role, like all audit committees, is there to provide assurance to the Archbishop's Council on the effectiveness of management, governance, risk management and internal controls over the works of the Archbishop's Council. We also have a key role in ensuring the accuracy and completeness of the annual report and financial statements. We undertake the same functions for Church of England Central Services, which is called Checks, which doesn't have a separate audit committee. I will talk about 3 areas: the annual report, the management of risks, and the system of the controls, including internal audit. Firstly, the annual report. The oversight role of the Audit Committee involves satisfying ourselves that the document accurately reflects the work of the Council, that it meets our statutory reporting compliance duties, and that the financial information presented in the accounts is accurate and complete, adopting appropriate accounting policies. As part of the process, we also carefully consider the areas of going concern, the particular risks faced by the Council, and the mitigating factors to support the Council in discharging their trustee responsibilities. This year, additional work was needed to be carried out as part of the external audit process because of the new auditing standards ISA 240. This required us to more clearly demonstrate whether management and those charged with governance have adequately ensured and understood the risks of material misstatement due to fraud and what has been put in place to mitigate and respond to these risks. These included consideration of fraud risks associated with cyber security, which has been a key focus area for the committee. We have undertaken that work seriously, recognising that resources lost to fraud cannot be used for the mission and ministry of the Church. In addition, our external auditors received a number of representations in respect of the Independent Safeguarding Board. They undertook additional work to review these, and I'm afraid to notify Synod that this resulted in an audit overrun fee. These primarily focused around the appropriateness of expenditure incurred in terms of the use of charitable funds and the arrangements for authorisation and budgetary control. However, the auditors found no reason to change the report and accounts. They made one control recommendation in relation to ensuring value for money when using external legal advisors and some general observations. Second, the committee reviews the risk register twice a year. We spent time challenging senior council staff to understand how they are managing and mitigating key risks to ensure they are in line with best practice. And you can see the results on page 46 to 49 of the annual report GS 2308. Third, it's the responsibility of the committee to agree an annual internal audit plan with the Director of Risk and Assurance. In line with best practice, we take a risk-based approach to ensure key strategic risks are reviewed with correct regularity. We also need to prioritise according to risk because we do have a finite budget, both for the small in-house audit team, which also supports other national church institutions, and for an external partner accountancy firm to support us on specific audits. In November 22, the committee reviewed and approved the internal audit plan for Archbishop's Council for 2023. We also noted that audits that couldn't be covered because of the internal audit resource constraints. We approved 3 specific audits for the Council for 2023. These were social impact investments, which were deferred from 2022. This is a really innovative programme with £25 million of it to invest to make a difference in communities across the country. And the committee wanted assurance of the controls and effectiveness. Grant management. The Council is now one of the largest grant-making bodies in the country, making grants of around £120 million a year. In the new triennium, we've introduced new processes and areas for investment in mission and ministry across the church, including racial justice and net zero. So it was critically important to ensure controls were operating effectively. The National Casework Management System project is another high-risk assurance audit. I don't think I need to explain to Synod why this is a high risk. This was a critical aspect of our response to ICSA and holds highly sensitive data from across the whole church. In addition, there are a number of audits in the plan which are pan-NCI and are areas that we would expect to interrogate regularly as a matter of good practice. This includes a counter-fraud review and review of anti-money laundering arrangements, audit of key control process areas such as accounts payable and payroll processes through the new people system, and audits relating to data security and disaster recovery. The audit plan was signed off by the whole committee at our November meeting. We did consider other priorities but concluded that this work programme represented an appropriate response to our principal risks at that time. I'm aware that some concerns have been raised about whether the internal audit plan for 2023 should have included an audit of the governance and arrangements for the Independent Safeguarding Board. Let me give you the chronology so Synod has full transparency. The possibility of doing an audit of the ISB was brought up in September 2022 to the Archbishop's Council. They considered this with members of the ISB present, but decided not to proceed with this suggestion. As Jamie described yesterday, the Council was trying to walk a very difficult tightrope of ensuring that the ISB had enough space to be operationally independent while still discharging their charitable trustee responsibilities. And at the time, just 9 months into the life of the ISB, we felt that the balance was in favour of allowing the ISB Phase 1 to continue their work without us hampering them and starting to develop proposals for Phase 2. The internal audit plan was then approved by committee at our November 2022 meeting, the 3rd of November, and an audit of the ISB was not considered to be amongst the highest risk for internal audit focus, given our limited resources and the items I've already described. ISB was discussed and an update from Archbishop's Council was given at that meeting prior to agreeing the audit plan. However, 3 members of the committee did write to me as chair on the 17th of November requesting that again I ask Archbishop's Council to consider making provision for an audit of the governance of the ISB. After discussion with the Independent Audit Committee members, I explained to those who had written to me that I felt that this should have been discussed at the Audit Committee meeting when we had had the opportunity to explore the issues together so that we ensured a holistic approach to agreeing the internal audit plan based on risk rather than considering individual items out of full context. Obviously, there does need to be some flexibility as circumstances or risk may change over time. But I believed we had approached the annual internal audit plan in the appropriate way based on the information available at that time. On balance, it seemed that an internal audit at that stage would only have highlighted risks and issues that were already well understood by Council. There was a further discussion at this point, in our March Audit Committee meeting as we were keeping a watching brief on the situation. The committee as a whole came to the conclusion that an audit at this point would interfere with the work going on by the Archbishop's Council to resolve the situation, which had of course continued to evolve. You'll appreciate that we continue to keep this matter under review, and it was discussed in our recent meeting in June. At the time, we agreed to hold an extra meeting of the Audit Committee to discuss matters in greater depth and consider our response as an Audit Committee given recent events. As will be clear from what I've described, there's been a variety of views from Audit Committee members on this matter and other matters too. And of course, this is one of the strengths of a committee, and I'm really grateful for the compassion and commitment of the members to help us operate effectively in discharging our responsibilities. It may not be the most glamorous of committees, but we do take our responsibilities very seriously. I'd like to thank all members of the Audit Committee for their work on behalf of Archbishop's Council. The Council, together with the Church of England Central Services, distributes significant amounts of grant funding and runs many key services for parishes and dioceses, and it's right that these are run with proper controls.
I'm sorry, can you wrap up now, please?
With risks managed well. And I move that the General Synod takes note of the paper standing in my name.
Thank you. Members, you will appreciate that we are pressed for time, so I'm going to ask for a speech limit of 3 minutes from the start. This item is now open for debate. Those wishing to speak, please stand. Those who are moving to their seats, if you could do this a bit more rapidly, please. I call Julie Ziegel and the lady standing there next. 3 minutes. Thank you.
Julie Ziegel, Oxford 377, Chair. I'm a member of the Archbishop's Council Finance Committee and by trade an accountant. I read the report of the Archbishop's Council Audit Committee with interest, and I'm pleased that it's been scheduled for debate. The work of the Audit Committee seems extensive, and I noted with a slightly raised eyebrow that in paragraph 3.3.2 that the external auditors were particularly focused on the going concern risk. A few years ago, as a member of the Audit Committee for Oxford Diocese, I also heard our auditor challenge us over going concern. It was the first year of the pandemic, the world had been rocked on its axis, and there was, I suppose, unusual uncertainty about the finances of the Church in many areas. I'm afraid, however, I firmly told our auditors that if they required qualification of Oxford's accounts over going concern, then given our relatively financially robust position, every diocese in the Church of England would have to be so qualified. They did back down, although not quite entirely. This makes me reflect that any going concern issue for the Archbishop's Council is in fact related to that of the diocese, which is why I also noted with interest in paragraph 3.5.1 that the Audit Committee also received a report on diocesan financial monitoring. I'd be interested to know more about how diocesan finances are monitored and whether that monitoring is more generalised or more specific to individual dioceses. But I am glad that there is some form of monitoring so issues can be picked up and discussed earlier rather than later. We are all interconnected, not least financially. I'm grateful for this detailed, careful work of the Audit Committee and its report.
The lady on my left, followed by Mr. Drake, and after Mr. Drake, I'll be looking for a motion for closure. Thank you.
Thank you. Helen King, Oxford 378. I want to just talk briefly on the subject of the 3.5.5, the request by the Audit Committee for an internal audit of the ISB, which the Archbishop's Council turned down. Now, if you go back to your records, which you won't, so I'll summarise it, February 2023 Synod, I asked a question about whether the ISB had been subject to scrutiny by the Audit Committee in relation to its formation and operation. And I was told, in answer to a supplementary on that, that the Audit Committee do not have the ability to request an audit. That was then changed. I had a letter from William Nye, including an attachment with a letter from Maureen Cole saying, actually, no, that was the wrong answer. And the answer was, yes, they do have the ability. So that was very interesting in itself. But what I'm worrying about now is, with hindsight, I would like to ask Maureen Cole, with hindsight, should this have happened? You've outlined the various stages in which it was discussed at Archbishop's Council, should there be an audit of the ISB, that it was felt they should be able to continue because they were quite a new body. Then in November 2022, it was decided it wasn't a risk. I'd just like to ask, that lessons learned question. Have you got anything that you'd like to do in future as a result of what's now happened with the ISB? Thank you.
Mr. Drake.
Gavin Drake, Sutherland, Nottingham, 421. I'd like to make 2 points, please. The first one is on the same point on 3.5.5. We've been told various reasons for this, and one of the reasons that the review was rejected was because the risk, the Director of Risk, the implication in the report is that the Director of Risk said the risk was low, and yet we seem to be aware that issues to do with the ISB governance was actually quite high. So I think we could do with some clarity over that. And secondly, I'm intrigued when you talk about when Mrs. Cole talked about the auditors questioning the cost of external legal, and if we could have some more detail on that, because in July last year, I asked question 172 about the cost of in-house and externally commissioned instructed lawyers, and the response I got from Mr. Nye was that the cost of the external lawyers was not readily available and it would be too costly to provide. Now, normally this would be a cost code on the account, it would be very simple to provide, so I'd be grateful if more details about the question about the external lawyers could be provided. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your brevity. I see no one else standing, and also there is no one indicating on screen either. So, Maureen Cole, can you respond, please, to the debate? You have up to 5 minutes to speak.
Okay, thank you very much for those questions, and they're all important questions. Julie, with regard to going concern, as we all know, external auditors have to go through that process, and it's been extended. And I think, yes, we do have to take diocese finances into control. It is part of our income as Archbishop's Council. It isn't as large as obviously the money coming from church commissioners, but it's nevertheless. And so from time to time, I know Finance Committee do get reports, and we do get asked for reports back, and we do look at those from diocese and understand what that situation is, because we are intrinsically linked. And just so you know, COVID, we've also looked at other facts other than COVID. So LLF, we have been thinking about diocese impact, finances, etc. Helen, I'm just very sorry. I gave the wrong answer at the time. Some people could look at it as conspiracy theory, that it wasn't then published. It wasn't. It was an administrative error of which the team apologise. This was about us understanding our remit within the ISB and what we wanted to do and how we did it. And so, as I understood it at the time, that we were well within our limits of looking at governance and the setup of ISB, but actually to go and look at the internal settings up of it, that wasn't. It was. And it was the contracted, and I apologise, which is why I corrected the answer. And yes, how we get that to the whole of Synod is a difficult one when there are so many questions for this team behind us. Gavin, I'm trying to remember your question, to be honest, and I apologise. But I think the one thing about risk is that in terms of ISB, we have to look at it from a number of things. For the legal perspective, Crow actually, you'll be surprised to say, and this is from an auditor's perspective, but it's not one that I don't think anyone would agree with actually, that we had possibly used external auditors for ISB rather than our own legal team, and it would have been more cost effective to use our legal team. It wouldn't have been right to have done that. And I think I would have had other questions from you about why weren't we independent and why do we use our legal team. So it was important that that was separate. And I'm hoping that that answers your question. And Gavin, if it doesn't, please come and see me and ask me to clarify. But thank you for your time. I hope that's given you some interest. I thank the team behind me. And please do come and talk to us about any issues, because we'd be delighted to talk to you about risk appetite, risk, and some of the issues that we face, because they are quite serious issues that face us all as a church nationally, at diocese and indeed at parish level. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Maureen. I now put item 51 to the vote by a simple show of hands to take note of the debate. Report, yes, sorry. Those in favor, please show. Thank you. Those against? That item is clearly carried. We now move to next item. Thank you.
So we now move to items 12 and 13, and you will see, and we're running a bit short of time, but there it is. You will see that item 12 is a presentation, after which there will be an opportunity for questions, and after that there is a motion moved by the Bishop of Truro at item 13. So let's deal with item 12 first. So I call on the Bishop of Truro to introduce the presentation. You have up to 10 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Synod. Before any of the project boards speak, I would like to give the first word to one of the members of our Survivor Working Group. Jane, you've heard from her already, but as we do that, let us please hold in our minds the responsibility on us all to speak graciously to and about one another. And some parts of this project are necessarily technical, process-based, but the whole thing is an effort to express the Church's deep repentance to survivors, and all of our conversations about this should therefore be based in compassion, in justice, and in love. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Synod, for giving me the privilege of speaking here again today, 5 years after Joe Kine stood as the first survivor to address Synod. And when she called upon you to borrow the courage of survivors to ensure that safeguarding could be transformed, and I'll leave it up to you to judge how far you've come in the last 5 years. So why redress? It's church-based abuse is a betrayal of trust that causes moral, spiritual and psychological injury, as well as the harm from abuse itself. It ruptures our relationship with our faith community and God. And as Judith Herman says, if trauma originates in a fundamental injustice, the full healing must require repair through some measure of justice from the whole community. Survivors need the Church to meet us with belief, acknowledgement, apology, and support to rebuild shattered lives. Redress is so much more than throwing money at survivors and hoping we will go away. What does good redress look like? Some key messages from the survivors in the working group and those we consulted in the survey. It should be generous, timely, and non-litigious. The process should be survivor-centred, treating us with humanity and compassion and providing independent advocacy and support. There should be risk and needs assessment and provision for any victims rejected by the scheme. Non-financial redress is also really important to many survivors, and we are developing ideas for this. Some of the examples I can give you are that at corporate level, a truth and reconciliation process, a public apology, perhaps public memorials, knowing that there's a clear impact from telling our stories to improve practice. And at a personal level, a personal apology, provision of therapy, chaplaincy and spiritual support, securing the practical support that people need, and restorative practice. In short, whatever it takes to rebuild shattered lives. There's a number of problems that we are posing the board to solve. For example, ensuring the scheme offers redress to all survivors, not just those that reach civil claims thresholds. Finding a way to pay for the scheme that is fair doesn't bankrupt parishes, but means survivors don't have to go cap in hand to the place of their abuse. Creating a process that doesn't re-traumatise, especially for new disclosures, and gaining the trust of all stakeholders, survivors, churches, lawyers, and insurers. It is vital that this is not another project like the ISB, where the Church promises much and delivers little, cruelly destroying your hope. Because redress represents so much more than the tangible support that is delivered by the scheme. I'm going to skip through the next 3 slides really quickly. To me, it represents freedom from trauma after my abuser told me that this was what God wanted for me, by demonstrating that this was not God's desire. It represents hope that perhaps the church does care and perhaps I can find healing. And it represents justice and restoration, not just for survivors, but for the whole body of Christ. So we need a commitment to whatever it takes to repair the rupture and wounds from abuse. For isn't that our mission, to restore our broken relationship with God and with each other? So isn't this work where the church should be leading the way? I don't have much faith in the church anymore, but I do have faith in God. I have faith in God to help us to live up to our part of the covenant, to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. And as child victim C of E says, safeguarding is love and compassion in action. I hope he's watching on the feed. Synod, I am asking you to support the development of the scheme. Be ambitious for survivors and for the whole church. Hold the board to account for delivering a scheme that is generous, inclusive, survivor-centred, and provides a lasting legacy that can change the culture of the whole church and offer survivors the possibility of life in all its fullness. Thank you.
It is really important that survivors have the first word in a debate and discussion such as this. So we come to you at a crucial stage in this project before legislation with a motion to test the mind of Synod and help us design a genuine process of repentance, which we can all embrace and honour. We have done an enormous amount of work on this scheme, arguably more in the last 3 years than other less complex schemes have managed with bigger teams working on them. And we are at a stage where every decision prompts another set of crucial questions to explore. Indeed, many of you have raised those questions with me or with others, and we are very grateful to all of those who have spoken into this. I don't want to repeat the substance of the paper. I'm mindful of time, and that what has, of course, been well publicised in that is the announcement that the Church Commissioners have allocated £150 million, which will help to underpin the scheme and make sure we respond promptly to survivors' applications. I'm very grateful for that allocation, but it is really vital to say that this is not a ceiling figure. What will determine the quantum of financial redress that survivors receive will not be the total sum available, but the nature of the abuse to which they have been subjected. Before you hear from Alex Kamenji with a reminder of some of the details, I want to outline for you some of the core commitments that lie at the heart of the scheme and have informed the work of the board. First, that it should be robust and fit for purpose. Secondly, that we should deliver that in as timely a manner as possible without compromising its quality. Thirdly, that it is co-produced with survivors. Fourthly, to ensure that it is about more than money. Redress is not simply financial, it is also psychiatric, therapeutic, spiritual and emotional. The vital acknowledgement of wrongdoing on the part of the church, apology and support for rebuilding lives. It's important to say too that we're not providing compensation per se, but redress. So this is not equivalent to a loss of earnings scheme, although the financial assessment model, once we have finalised it, will probably include some discretion for aggravating factors. But we are clear that the focus is on the nature of the abuse experienced and that financial awards will be assessed consistently so that people who have had similar experiences of abuse are served equitably. The paper touches on the biblical concept of covenant, which is fundamental to all this. You have read all that already, so I will not repeat it. But as you know, with Old Testament covenants, it is not at all inappropriate that covenantal commitment to one another, and crucially to victims and survivors, should be underpinned by law. And legislation will therefore be brought forward to clarify where responsibility for redress lies within the multiple institutions of the Church, and with the assurance of support from elsewhere in the Church as that is needed. So I hope that in this scheme, grace and law will work together. And in fact, I do believe there is real grace here, because the scheme will provide more and not less reassurance to church bodies, and will decrease, rather increase, their vulnerability as we take a whole church covenantal approach to this. But above all else, I hope and pray that this scheme will provide at least a modicum of grace to survivors who have been sorely denied it. I'm going to pass over to Alex Kabenji, who's going to take us through some of the details, and then to Bishop Joanne, who's going to look at the next steps.
Good afternoon, Synod. Before I start, I just wanted to say thank you to Jane for her courage and her ability to be here today and tell us as it is. So I'm going to talk you through some of the steps here with regards to redress. So I'm going to talk about the application of it, eligibility. Who can apply for redress? Survivors of sexual abuse, physical abuse, psychological abuse, emotional abuse, and spiritual abuse. And this would be perpetrated by someone who is representing the Church of England. They may be lay, they may be ordained, they may be paid, or they might be a volunteer. And it could be in England or anywhere else in the world. But they must be working on behalf of the Church of England in those capacities. So how might the scheme work? So survivors would make an application through a third-party supplier. We feel that there needs to be independence from the Church. And as a church, we don't necessarily have the skill sets to be able to deliver elements of this scheme. So we will need help in that department. There will be a consistent assessment process, and this will be based on the balance of probability. And there'll be other bespoke forms of redress that may be appropriate to a survivor, around apologies, acknowledgement of the abuse, and any other further action. And we've got to understand that for each person, it will be different. We are grateful that we have our survivors who are working with us on designing what this might look like. And for that, we are truly grateful. The financial awards will be standardized with a series of pay bands, which will be used consistently. And that will be applied according to the nature of the abuse and other aggravating factors. This version of the scheme will run for 5 years, but there has to be mechanisms that are built in to be able to see where we are, monitor, reflect, learn, do we need to extend, etc. So with that, I thank you for listening and look forward to hearing your suggestions, comments and ideas, and I'll hand over to Bishop Joanne now to talk us through the next steps.
Thanks, Alex, and thank you, Synod. I've just begun being a little bit involved in this work relating to redress since I began in this role after Easter, and I'm grateful to the staff and to the board members, and particularly to the survivors on that, for the way that they have grappled with the issues and helped me to understand where this has come from and where they'd like it to go. We're at a point now where much work is being done, but many questions arise, and that's why it feels important to consult you here at Synod before legislation, so that we can benefit from your insights for the next steps. So among the work streams for the next few months are three main areas. One, really crucial work with survivors to make sure we completely understand and agree the criteria for forms of abuse that will be recognised here and the forms of redress that should be made available. They're really careful conversations. They really matter. The second part is a comprehensive procurement process to make sure we find a supplier who can help us with the final technical stages of designing a scheme and then going on to deliver it. But let's be clear, this is not just about technical competence, it's about attitude and understanding and compassion. And thirdly, finding a way for the whole church, which is a key concept at the heart of this work, the whole church to work together to contribute through insurance, but also through other contributions to make sure that we honour the experiences of survivors and apologise fully to them. Thank you. I'll hand back to Bishop Philip briefly.
So to conclude, I just want to affirm that in taking a whole church approach to expressing repentance to survivors, we are not creating a new vulnerability for church bodies, but rather supporting one another in managing responsibilities which already exist and which are consistent with the response to survivors set out in the House of Bishops guidance, and where there may already be legal liability in the event of a civil claim. This is therefore about giving concrete, substantial expression to our core conviction as a church that safeguarding is everyone's business. Synod, this is a serious piece of work that encourages our serious engagement with it. We need to have a good, open conversation about this, but above all else, this is an opportunity for us to express our corporate repentance. We cannot put right such historic wrong as we have discovered, but we should corporately express genuine repentance for what has happened. I'm sure you don't need me to remind you, but I will, that confession and repentance are not the same thing. After confession, in the Book of Common Prayer, evening prayer, within the absolution itself, the priest beseeches the Lord to grant us true repentance, that those things may please him, which we do at this present, and that the rest of our life hereafter may be pure and holy, so that at last we may come to his eternal joy through Jesus Christ our Lord. And may this redress scheme be in itself not only a mark of our contrition and our confession, but of our genuine and our heartfelt repentance. Thank you. I think, Chair, with your indulgence, are we having questions of clarification?
Yes, people can ask questions. Now, are there any people who want to ask questions? You, sir, in the blue shirt, and Bishop, and then you, sorry.
So, Mark Bennett, Oxford 184. Members may remember that the last synod, I didn't want to take note of the safeguarding report because this work hadn't been advanced, and I'm very pleased to see it having reached this stage where some decisive action can be taken, and I welcome it. Two questions. Mr. X was reported as receiving a kind of care which we didn't know was effective or not. What are we doing to research what are the effective interventions for survivors whose experience of being abused in church will be different from survivors in other contexts, and make sure that we understand the range of interventions that are effective and worth supporting and ineffective and not worth supporting. And also, I was very pleased to hear about non-financial redress being a central part of this. What's being done to ensure that we have the capacity as a church to meet the pastoral demands inevitably involved in that relational work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Beverly Mason, 0352 Northern Suffragans. Thank you for calling me. Thank you very much indeed for the work that's taking place here, for the ongoing work. It's very encouraging as we seriously shoulder the responsibility of redress. My question is liturgical provision by the Liturgical Commission being sought that expresses lament, confession, repentance, healing and restoration as part of our serious engagement of redress? Thank you.
Judith Maltby, University's TEIs 452. Thank you. And I want to speak in favour of the general direction of this scheme, and I welcome further work on it, and thank you for it. My question is, do we have a definition of spiritual abuse?
Thank you all very much for that. Mark, I can't exactly, I just wrote down non-financial redress. I can't remember where are you? I can't remember the exact substance of your question. Would you mind just quickly repeating it? Right, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, capacity, that was the issue. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so to try and deal with these, the researching of effectiveness of interventions, that's really helpful, really important. We are doing, and we will continue to do, research of other schemes, which are both church-based and non-church-based schemes. I do think we have a lot to learn from other sources. I think as a church, we're not on the whole terribly good at learning from expertise that's out there, and we do absolutely want to do that. The capacity for non-financial redress, given that we will be commissioning an outside provider, my expectation is that the capacity will be there for whatever is needed. And we do need to recognise that non-financial redress costs. And that clearly needs to be recognised. Bev, we have begun to think about that in terms of some kind of national service. Whether the Liturgical Commission could take further work on, I think it would be ideal if they could, and providing some resources, I would very much welcome that. Judith, definition of spiritual abuse. There is, of course, very, very little kind of case experience around there about this, but I think it is increasingly understood. We are categorizing spiritual abuse under the broader heading of psychological abuse, and we have again been drawing on expertise to help us to develop our understanding around that.
3 more questions. The Dean of the Arches, Simon Butler, and I can't remember your name, sorry. No, the lady. Not you.
Morag Ellis, 454. I have a question to Synod, but I have some observations as well. I would like to commend the motion to Synod, and I, as a board member, wish publicly to pay tribute to the survivor members on our board and the group who work with them. The grace which they have shown in this work to our church is truly amazing and humbling, to me at least. They are helping the church in this work. It is hard work for all of us, engaging difficult questions about law and grace, but I ask Synod to note, please, their great contribution to this work. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Simon Butler, Southwark 221. 2 quick questions. Firstly, in the light of earlier discussions, governance. A third-party supplier, what will the governance look like? And how will the council, or whoever sees it, look at the audit function so that we get good value? There's a tension between those 2 things, I recognise. The second thing is about confidentiality. Confidentiality about payments. I can foresee some competitive pain emerging when different payments are disclosed. And I wonder how we will do our best to ensure, whilst recognising the sensitivities around confidentiality and secrecy in the survivor community, how we will ensure that we don't end up with that sort of competitive comparison.
Thank you.
Emma Joy Gregory, Bath and Wells, 247. My question is about clarifying where safeguarding begins and ends. So, would a person who was a victim of abuse or sexual assault, but who was over 18 at the time of the incident, still be eligible for redress as part of this scheme? If not, how might we limit further harm to those victims who don't fall within the remit of the scheme?
Thank you very much. To answer that one first, yes, that would absolutely be in scope without question. Simon, your questions are very good, very helpful. The work of the Redress Scheme Board is to set the scheme up. There clearly will be, and we've only just begun to talk about this, but we have recognised there will be governance issues going forward once the scheme is set up and with the third-party supplier. I think that's the terms of reference will be different than our terms of reference for setting the board up, but that clearly will need to happen, and there will clearly need to be some kind of audit function that oversees it as well. I think your point about confidentiality versus competition, as it were, is really well made, and that is, I think, is precisely why we want to go to an external supplier who has experience of this stuff, so they can advise us within the scheme design as to how that would work best. But I do recognise the complexity of the question. And Morag, yes, absolutely, I entirely agree with you. Incredibly grateful. The way that survivors engage with us in the work of the Redress Board is incredibly gracious, and I'm extremely grateful to them.
You, sir, in the white shirt. You two, sorry. Two of you. Not together.
Thank you, Chair. Joe Hawes, 54 Deans. We know that consequent upon confession is repentance, and consequent upon repentance is action, and part of action is this redress scheme. However, I suspect that survivors and victims might also require of the Church that as we all learn in healthy safeguarding culture, the creation of a healthy culture in safeguarding training, the creation of a healthy safeguarding culture within institutions is also an imperative. Where will that piece of work sit when we are looking at the abolition of Archbishop's Council and the creation of SENS? It may not sit appropriately in the redress scheme, but it needs to sit somewhere. But it needs to sit somewhere. I think I was cut off.
Yeah, I caught that. Thank you.
Chantal Knockman, 108, Durham 108. Sorry. Does it matter? Probably doesn't matter. Sorry. I think in some ways this builds on what Judith asked. I appreciate the direction. It's encouraging and it's good from what I can see so far. But can we be assured as a synod that the Church's use of their exemption to the Equality Act 2010 will not have the consequence of reducing accessibility to the redress scheme for LGBTQIA survivors, please?
Nicola Denyer, Newcastle 368. Speaking in favour of this, as somebody who in a previous life was a nurse, a midwife and a safeguarding training officer for the NHS, so have experience in working with survivors, victims and also professionals. So my question really is, how far are you liaising with charities, the NHS, local authorities about what they do? Because I think, as we've heard this afternoon, it might be very difficult for survivors to actually come and tell somebody in church. They might well go to outside agencies, so how will you explore or advertise that we can do this so that the message can get through to survivors who might not come to church?
Thank you very much. Clearly, the scheme will need to be advertised. We absolutely do not want it to be secret. We want it to be accessible. We want it to be known about, and we are also committed and have been learning from other schemes and good practice elsewhere. There is no reason at all why the Equality Act should impinge upon or limit the scheme in any way. Joe, I wanted to say something wise and intelligent to your answer, but I can't remember what it was. But strictly speaking, yes, of course, the governance, the proper governance question that you raised is out of the scope of the work of the Redress Board, but it is an important question to which we as a church need corporately to pay attention, and I thank you for raising it.
So more questions? Can you hear me? Yes, you can. Gentleman there, the lady there, and the lady there. And can I just remind you that there are two things we're talking about. One is the presentation, the other is the motion. I have to say that nobody has put in to speak on the motion, So it may be that that won't take long, but I have to bear in mind there are two things. So, yes, please.
Thank you for calling me. Robert Perry, 426 Truro. I'm happy to support the motion. Any reticence I might have felt at asking my diocesan bishop a question dissipated last Thursday when I learnt that he was abandoning us for in God's own county, west of the Tamar, for the sultry delights of Hampshire. Never mind. Two questions. Firstly, in the paper, paragraph 211, there's reference to paying for this scheme and the requirement on various church bodies to take out insurance to cover that. It just strikes me that parishes in particular with no recorded history of abuse and no expectation of it, which is a silly thing to say, but I think you know what I mean, might well have some pushback on that. No doubt you've got that in mind if people feel they're being required to pay for something which is nothing to do with them. That's the first thing. The second thing is twice in the paper there's reference to, I think it's twice, there's reference to using a legal firm as your delivery agent. No doubt you've got a reason for appearing to confine it to legal firms. I've got nothing against lawyers, some of my best friends, etc. But it strikes me that there may well be other firms which could do the job equally well, and I'd have thought we wouldn't want to narrow ourselves unnecessarily in the choice of whoever's working with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, very much.
Lisa Batty, Manchester 169. Thank you for calling me. Some of the respondents within the clergy disciplinary measure regard themselves as victims of that measure, bearing in mind people like Father Griffin. And I'm wondering, is this a scheme open to some of them?
Michaela Suckling, Sheffield 411. Firstly, I want to thank you so much for all the work you've done. I had the pleasure of meeting someone who's on the working party, and she said that survivors really do feel listened to and they do have hope in this. So I'm really glad that we're debating and asking these questions. As a parish nurse, I work with a number of people who have experienced trauma and abuse, and I really struggle to find them the appropriate counselling and support that they need, specifically around their trauma response in maybe EMDR and dialectic behaviour therapy. So I just raise a little concern. Are we raising hope that we're going to offer these people therapy that actually we can't deliver because it's just not there, because the system's overwhelmed? So I'd be glad to hear about that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for those kind words, Michaela. I hear that challenge. I hear that challenge. The procurement process is absolutely vital to this, and ensuring that we make the best provision that we can is really important. This does slightly connect with my friend Robert's question about why we might use a legal firm. We don't have to use a legal firm, but our advice is that that's where the expertise lies. Robert, if you have other suggestions, then do please let us know. The answer to the question around CDM is both that the scheme clearly defines what is and is not within scope, and it clearly defines what is abuse. Indeed, I would say in both things it tends to take a broad definition. I clearly couldn't comment on any individual, even hypothetical case, because we would need to test it against those things. But do please be assured that careful work of definition has absolutely happened. Coming back to Robert's first point, and I'm really grateful to you for raising this. The first thing to say is that any church body, whatever that church body may be, ought already to have public liability insurance. And if you haven't, then get it. Secondly, I just want to stress that this is not actually about creating greater liability. We are already liable. But actually, this is about sharing the liability. We're still working on the financial formula, but we do not want any body, and as in an organisational body, to be hung out to dry in the delivery of this scheme, but share the responsibility, but also recognise that we cannot outsource our responsibility to another body and say, well, you pick up the responsibility, when the responsibility may lie in a particular body in a particular place. I have remembered my wise answer to your question, Joe. A survivor yesterday at our fringe meeting said this could be a scheme that changes the culture of the church. And if it does that, I mean, the primary aim is to do the best we can by survivors, but if it changes our culture in the process, then that will, well, rejoice my heart.
Martin Sewell and the Bishop. Now, can I consider with you the time frame, because we're due to finish at 6 o'clock. Now, it would be helpful, I think, if you would allow me to propose an extension of the sitting for no more than 15 minutes. So those in favour, please show. Those against? Thank you very much indeed. So that's carried. So we're going to go to 6:15. Now, I'm going to think to myself that it's probably more important to ask questions than to debate the motion. Now, if that's right, well, there we are. We'll come to that. Mr. Sewell.
Martin Sewell, 390, Rochester. The origins of the redress scheme was a synod rebellion organised by Peter Adams and David Lamming, who's sitting up in the public gallery. And the response was that they decided they had to do something about it, and I seconded this, so I'm heavily invested in the success of this scheme. I've been asked by one of the survivors to raise a difficult point, which not a controversial one, but a difficult technical or philosophical point. Are we only going to look at claims that are nailed on legal certainties? I don't think we are. But what I want to ask is, there will be some cases which wouldn't pass muster in law, but you just know from a feeling in your water that this person ought to be helped. Now, when we come to that stage, you're going to need discretions built into this scheme. And I hope that when we come to formulate it, we have a bit of wiggle room. And one of the ways you could do that, of course, is that some of the survivors say are not in it for finance. Some of the survivors are extremely wealthy. But we might be able to say, for example, well, would you like to have your pain acknowledged, putting your money into this pot here that could be dispensed for somebody who may not quite be able to prove it, but we think is a right person to be helped at this time. So can we get the balance between rights and discretion built into the scheme in some way? It's difficult, I know, but we try. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin.
Michael Beasley, Bath and Wells 006. Has the planning group been able to estimate as yet how many people this is likely to affect?
First of all, I'm sure all of us in this chamber who remember him would like to welcome David Lamming back to our company. Welcome back, David. It wasn't long ago that you joined us from a hospital bed, so we're very pleased to see you in the pink and in the flesh. Martin, thank you very much for that very helpful contribution, and I just want to say I entirely agree with you. There is one very good reason for using the civil standard of proof, and that is that we are using insurers, and that's what insurers work by. But we're not just using insurers. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that should be our starting point, but that there should be an element of discretion. I mean, by its very nature, we know that abuse thrives on secrecy. We're not going to have witnesses so often. So we need to make an assessment which is just and which is fair and which is above all gracious. Michael, the short answer to your question is no. We have no idea of what the quantum might be, and we want to be prepared to respond to as many people as we need to. But that's not for want of trying to do some research, but we just don't know.
I'm going to look for a final 3 questions. You, sir, the gentleman, and The lady up there.
Peter Adams, 392 St Albans. Chair, I'm putting a question in instead of a point in the debate, so have a grace. I want to welcome this and particularly thank Jane for her contribution and underline and ask, please, Bishop, can we consider a process of truth and reconciliation? I believe some of the things we've seen this afternoon are a result of a growing ill temper amongst us that has resulted from a long series of stuff, of abuse. In the context of our own diocese of St Albans, as we look at the sole survivor situation, I'm very aware, as lay chair of the diocese, of a lot of the angst and anger from past stories piling in upon a new story. And again, we saw that this afternoon. So in order to deal with some of the toxicity in the system, can we please consider very strongly a truth and reconciliation process? Thank you.
Daniel Matavu, Oxford 379. I first of all want to thank you for the hard work that's already gone into developing this scheme and the care that's been taken in ensuring that it's just and fair and generous. I just wanted to raise a query in respect to paragraph 4.3 in the paper, which gives a hypothetical example where abuse is perpetrated by a parish youth worker who's also a swimming coach and carries out these duties distinctly. What is said is that if they harm someone they meet through youth work and not through swimming, then the situation is within scope. But if they harm someone they meet through swimming, then it is not in scope. I would raise a query as to whether whether something's in scope or not should be determined according to the point at which they meet somebody. I would suggest that if they met someone through swimming first, but the abuse happened during their youth work role, then they should properly qualify and be within the scheme. It should be determined according to the location of the abuse.
No. Oh, sorry, we've got the third one.
May Christie, Southwark 222. Thank you so much for this, and I really welcome this development with the redress scheme. Basically, when selecting the law firm that we're going to have administer this, which it sounds like it's very likely that we'll do, I would love to hear a commitment to not hiring a law firm which would have what we would consider to be a conflict of interest. For instance, one which is represented the national church or a diocese or another church or related person, a priest, in a conflicting way, particularly advising on safeguarding and abuse cases. And there was another question that someone else asked, which I think is a good one, which is regarding children. Would parents be able to access the redress scheme on behalf of their children? I'm sure that's probably envisaged anyway, but worth asking.
I would be astonished if that weren't the case, May, but thank you. To try and take these again in reverse order. I think the point you made is very well made, and any procurement process would need to assess reputational risk for the church, and we have to ensure the evident independence of the scheme. So that may well rule out some providers who for other reasons might qualify. Daniel, as you, Daniel, beg your pardon, as you described that situation, I thought, well, of course that's in scope. The way that you re-described it, it's always difficult when you've got hypothetical situations, because of course you can't necessarily compartmentalize life, but certainly the way that you re-described that, my instinctive thought was yes, of course that would be in scope. Peter, the truth and reconciliation idea, that has actually come out in a paper that we looked at the board just last Wednesday. And in the paper that the Survivors Working Group have drawn up about non-financial redress, it would be, I suggest, a huge piece of work theoretically possibly outside the scope of the Redress Board, but that is not to say, of course, that it might not be a very important and a significant thing for us to do. And I just want to give an absolute wholehearted amen to your heartfelt plea that we change the culture of the church. And you know, everything that we've been through today indicates how necessary that is. This scheme in itself isn't going to do it, but if it plays its part in that, then that would be wonderful.
That concludes item 12. I think we're grateful to all the people who participated. We now move to item 13. The Bishop to move item 13. You have up to 10 minutes, but I'll get into terrible trouble if you use it.
I had two quotations from contributions that survivors have made. One I've already referenced. We need a scheme that changes the culture of the church. Earlier on, Jane said, "Don't turn your back on survivors." This, it seems to me, is one way, not the only way, not a perfect way, but it is one way that we can look survivors full in the face and say sorry. So I move the motion standing in my name. And I think that was less than 10 minutes.
So there is, I'm very grateful for that, there is a 3-minute speech limit. If you're crafty, you could actually ask a question and the Bishop will answer it in his reply. So that will actually go back to item 12, but there we are. Miss Ozanne and this lady here and that lady there, sorry.
Miss Anne Oxford 380. I'm grateful to the Chair for calling me and to Synod for hearing me. I know I've spoken a lot during these sessions, but I speak today as a victim and a survivor who's very concerned about how this will work for victims. I welcome this motion and I will vote for it. But the stark reality is that many of us have been through abuse, which we've gone to the police about, or we've been through CDMs, I've done both, but where there was no proof, and so the cases were dropped. And those were very painful, long periods, often for me, one case a year and the other a year and a half, where I got very badly traumatized and burnt. I haven't even talked about conversion therapy, which was impossible to prove, but they've all left their scars. And the thought of having to come forward and trying to persuade on the balance of probabilities the church that they should recompense me fills me with dread, because at the moment there is zero trust. And I know we've been saying that all day, but if I don't feel I can trust the church, and I know many of you, how do people who've been far removed feel? So we need to find a system that will really enable people to have some confidence in, I think, a go-between. Asking me to go to a lawyer or speak to someone in the church is going to re-traumatize me. And I know you're working with victims, and I know Jane has often raised this, and I'm very grateful to Jane for her work. But we really do have to see how difficult it is for those of us who've been on the receiving end of abuse and power to take even a step forward into this scheme. And I do hope we will look at creative ways of trying to make it as painless as possible, and also that we will trust them and not think they're just trying to get one over and they're just trying to get some money. I think we may need to have a generosity, as Martin Schill pointed out, where we may, frankly, end up, perhaps having a few cases which aren't as robust as we thought, because the alternative is to re-traumatize victims like myself. So please, can we, perhaps Bishop Philip, you'll be able to respond to that, but is there a way of having a liaison officer that looks at how we can better look at the balance of probabilities? Thank you.
Julie Connolty, 51 Northern Suffragans and Deputy Lead Bishop for Safeguarding. I want to speak in favour of this motion. Thank you as well to all those who have been working on this scheme. I am hugely grateful. Jesus offered some very challenging words about the spirit in which we should respond to requests for assistance or even legal action. He said, if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Of course, survivors and victims should not have to sue or beg. We should not need to be forced to respond well. We ought to be generously offering support and the redress that is owed. And I hope and trust, I do still trust, that this is indeed the spirit in which the redress scheme will continue to be developed. If anyone wants your coat, give them your cloak as well.
Lindsay Llewellyn-Macduff, 201 Rochester. Thank you for calling me. I think this is my maiden speech if questions don't count. I'm in favour of the motion, but I just wanted to step back a little bit. Redress seems the obvious solution to the inheritance that the Church of England is trying earnestly to process. But however good this looks, I don't think this redress will necessarily end the circle of mistrust, grievance and injury that we keep lapping. And I don't think it's the solution because I think there's a deeper problem, and we will keep circling this drain until we address it. Because the Church of England has a problem with power. The writer and chaplain Geoffrey Byrne coins the phrase root sin to describe a wrong so deeply buried, often generations deep, that a community or an organisation can no longer properly see it and can no longer act outside it. He says it means the organisation cannot just draw a line under it and move on, because every attempt to redress it, to fix it, or to stop it from continuing is in fact shaped by it and destined to compound it. Our root sin, I think, is our historic and present collusion with power. I think, too, that we know that the solution to this is repentance, but a repentance that looks at the source of the problem. It is more than just an apology, even an apology with a price tag, because an apology changes nothing about the root. However good this looks, we cannot see straight to know what it will take to set things right, and we do not have the right to determine it. If we are going to do anything about any of the root problems, the abuse of power against the vulnerable, the bullying, the racial injustice, the ageism, on and on, if we are to free ourselves of the root sin that's throttling the life of God's church and God's mission, we have to look beyond the symptoms and address the cause. This outline and proposal of redress does look really good, and I, as I said, support the motion, but it may perhaps be the cart, and we have as yet totally failed to get ourselves a horse. So I am a little afraid that it will not in fact take us anywhere new.
Looking for one more speaker. Yes, Mr. Saul. After which I'm minded to test the mind of Synod on a motion for closure.
Martin Sewell, Rochester 390. I'm going to address Jane's really interesting and important question, coming from my professional experience as a safeguarding lawyer for many years, now retired. But following the murder of the child abuse of Mariah Cole in 1973, one of the great innovations that was invented was to put in a children's guardian whose job was to represent the interests of the child. And the children's guardian is an extremely experienced social worker, professionally regulated. They're self-employed. They are spread all over the country. There's lots of them. They're habituated to dealing with people in distress, with people with learning difficulties, with children, with violent adults, and all sorts of things of that kind. And they are trusted by the courts so much that when the children's guardian presents a report to somebody like me, and I handed it in to the judge, if the judge disagreed with the recommendation, he has to actually write down why he's disagreeing with the children's guardian. So you're talking about high-level expertise of somebody who actually knocks on your door and says, "I'd like to talk to me, give me a cup of tea and tell me all about it, and I'll get it sorted." Now, it seems to me that's a very easy entry level for us to get the sort of independent, it's genuinely independent, expertise to solve the problem that Jane, you don't have to go to some lawyer's office, you don't have to talk to a suit, you talk to somebody who's sensible. They talk to the lawyer, they take it to where it needs to go, they get it sorted. That's the sort of model we should think about. Hope that's creative enough for you.
Now, I'm going to test the mind on Synod as to whether item 13 has been sufficiently debated. I therefore put the motion for closure on item 13. Those in favour, please show. Those against. So the motion for closure is clearly carried. So I call upon the Bishop to respond. You have up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, very much indeed, and thank you all for those very helpful comments. I do want to say this. I don't want to overpromise for the scheme. I understand people's scepticism. I can only say that we are doing as much as we can to ensure, as I said at the beginning, that this scheme is robust, fit for purpose, and is put in place in as timely a manner as possible. Julie, thank you for that reminder. Grace has to be hardwired into the system as it is hardwired into the gospel, and I'm grateful for that. And that does, of course, have a bearing on the issue of the standard of proof. As I said earlier, the civil standard of proof works very well, given that we are using insurers and that part, at least, of the settlement of the scheme will depend upon public liability insurance that is already in place. But we must not stick with the letter of the law. We must be willing, I believe, to go beyond that. Lindsay, I don't want to say for a minute that this is a solution. I would never use that language. I don't think it enables us to draw a line. Survivors don't draw a line, so why should we draw a line? It is not an end to a circle of mistrust, but it might help. And I wholly agree that culture change is what is needed, and if this helps change the culture of the church, then I will be very happy, but it will not do that by itself. Jane, your heartfelt point about not going to a lawyer, not speaking to the church, that absolutely needs to be hardwired into the design of the scheme. Martin, thank you very much for that suggestion. I think that is just the kind of model that we need to explore. I don't want to say anything else. I think I do want to say, actually, can we please, there will be many questions going forward, and it is right, Synod, that you should ask difficult questions of this. But after the difficulties and challenges that we have been through, I do believe, hand on heart, this is something that we should all get behind and support and do the very best that we can. So what am I supposed to say now, Chair? Do I now move the motion standing in my name? That's what I do then. I move the motion standing in my name.
Now, it seems to me that it's appropriate that there should be a counted vote of the whole Synod. This is an important matter, and therefore it will be a counted vote of the whole Synod on item 13.
The voting period is now open and will end in 1 minute.
I should have said in my haste that those present in Central Hall using the voting handsets and who wish to vote in favour should press 1, those against should press 2, those wishing to record an abstention should press 3. Those participating remotely should use the online voting platform and vote or register an abstention using the buttons on the screen.
The voting period will end in 15 seconds. The voting period has now ended.
On item 13, there voted in favour 324, against none, recorded abstentions 1. So the motion is clearly carried. That concludes this item of business, and evening worship follows shortly.